Hey everybody, I thought I would continue with my investigation into Nick Freitas's condemnation of the left and his long video, 25,000 words, on why coexistence, quote unquote, with the quote unquote left is no longer possible. I've been finding it cathartic to go through this ideology. I've definitely been learning some things. Whoever wants to follow me on this investigation is welcome to. For instance, I've been learning how focused they actually are on reading leftist texts. I almost feel like in their hearts, these guys want to be leftists. I mean, they're so incredibly focused. They want to be polyamorous. They want to be free thinkers or whatever. But, you know, I'm sure they would pillory me for saying that or whatever. But the focus on, you know, whether it's pedagogy of the oppressed or Karl Marx or Gramsci, I mean, they've read these texts closer than most people I know who are actually leftists. So they really care. They've, you know, and as I mentioned before, they've actually learned from these texts and they've incorporated their ideas into their sort of Christian authoritarian constructs, a lot of which seem related to the Seven Mountain movement, which says that the future of America is to bring every element of life under a Christian theocratic rule, which includes family, which includes business, which includes politics. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You know, what you repress hangs around. Anyway, let's go. Now they're talking about the family and how leftists, but apparently also like liberals and Democrats want to control children's education, want to control the family. Let's see a little bit more what they have to say.
There's one more thing that I want to read from Marx, because just listen to this and tell me if this doesn't sound familiar. He continues here right off of where we left off earlier a few minutes ago, and he said, "Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime, we plead guilty. But you say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And your education is not that also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society, by means of school, etc. The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education, but they do seek to alter the character of that intervention and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class."
And keep in mind, they
Does that not sound so similar to the stuff that you've heard from progressives when it comes to education, raising children, family creation?
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned last time, you know, we now have a situation where the Trump administration, Heritage Foundation, are seeking to dismantle, you know, the public school system, PBS, and they want to replace PBS with something called PragerU. And you can watch a video, a cartoon from PragerU, you can find it online, where they're almost like promoting. They have Columbus talking about slavery and how, in some cases, slavery was kind of like a normal thing. So I think the point is that, you know, the human mind is naturally permeable and flexible. And however you're acculturated, whatever language, whatever morals and so on, you know, that whatever, you will end up with an imprint of an ideology. And so then the question is, who you know, who's controlling that imprint to a certain extent. But I think that there is a difference in which, you know, like the way I grew up, I'm quite proud of my like early education, even though I ended up dropping out of college. I went to Bank Street School for Children, which was a very progressive school. It still is actually on 112th Street in New York. And the focus on that school was really on learning how to learn and the sort of, you know, the sort of understanding that, yeah, we're like, you know, we should always be inquiring and not take authority for granted. We actually called our teachers by their first names. And it's set up, in some ways, I think, a very good template. So they're looking for more of a patriarchal...
when you hear
and so they will say things like, we're not trying to say dissolve or abolish the family in the sense that we eliminate having kids. Well, some of them are going that far, right? But they're saying, no. You don't understand. This has all been pre-programmed. We're trying to deprogram you from things that you think are neutral and natural. And we're saying, no, your understanding of education is not neutral.
Yeah.
It's influenced by something.
Right.
And that something is this bourgeois
Right, because there's no actual neutrality in anything. Like everything is culture, everything is indoctrination. And yeah, here he's talking about abolish the family.
Non-Marxist, non-leftist interpretation of how to do these things.
Well, and they also, I mean, you see in the way that Marx, because part of the problem here is
I mean, ironically enough, my own adult daughter brought up this abolish the family movement, and I actually read a couple of the books, and it's an extreme idea, but I guess I do kind of think there are issues with the way the family structures private life, and where it creates society based on private care. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a leftist, but and also the passing through of wealth through family lines, and what that does to society, particularly when you have the kind of system we have now.
People were criticizing the communists, like, well, how do you replace if husbands and wives are no longer a thing, if mothers and fathers are merely it's merely a biological choice to propagate the species, then who is ultimately responsible for these things? It's like, the collective. The collective is responsible for not just educating the child, the collective is responsible for raising the child. And that way, because in that way, what they see is, it's this idea is the child is now liberated from the parents, and the parents are liberated from the child. And so it's all about you being, but you have to be obligated to something, because somebody has to actually fulfill those roles in educating and raising. Well, the state.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would once again point out that the nuclear family is a really problematic structure for raising children, and we're probably meant to be more. I mean, our innate original state was more, kind of indigenous communities where people took care of each other's kids, and there were structures around that, rather than in our society where women have to waste so much of their most productive and creative years often. I mean, sometimes men too, but often it falls onto women to do the bulk of the childcare, and it's actually not that great a system. So yeah, in a mass society, you're trying to figure out a structure that substitutes for those indigenous community bonds. And actually, when I wrote How Soon Is Now, I suggested that maybe in the future you could actually look at those indigenous community models and think about how they could be kind of like reintegrated on a neighborhood basis.
Will do that, or the dictatorship of the proletariat will do that. It's important to understand that insofar as there is any difference between socialism and communism, it's that Marx imagined this world where eventually no state would be necessary, because you would have a complete dictatorship of the proletariat. That's their heaven. The socialists, if you're looking at Lenin's definition, it was the idea that socialism was this
Yeah, I don't know what he thinks is so great about the state, by the way. I mean, we have it now. There were times before the state when there were these, kind of more indigenous communities that had pros and cons. I mean, nothing is kind of, perfect. But anyway, let's go on.
And then what happens? You haven't gotten rid of hierarchy. You haven't created a hyper-egalitarian society. You've just created a different dictatorship of the majority. Right? You haven't gotten rid of exploitation. You've just changed the mechanism by which it's realized.
Well, actually, I don't agree. I mean, I don't like the phrase the dictatorship for the proletariat for all the reasons, that it raises so many alarm bells. But there are alternatives to hierarchical structures. And this is where I really recommend this book by the anthropologist Pierre Klaust, Society Against the State, where he spent a lot of time with Amazonian indigenous societies, I think some North American indigenous cultures. And he noted that these societies were actually organized so that hierarchical power relations could not emerge. And even though many of these societies had what was called the chief was much more like a mediator. He was the storyteller. He held the myths of the community. If the problems arose, he would mediate and so on. He often had a lot of the lore and so on, but he couldn't really order people, to do things in the same way that we think about it. Partially because of those communities, if they lived in the jungle and so on, if you tried to order people and they didn't like it, they would just ultimately take off and start a new community. Also, a lot of those cultures had like what was called the Council of Grandmothers. So there was an older women group who would kind of actually keep watch on the chief. And if the chief went too far out of bounds in terms of ordering people around or getting into his ego or dominating, they would have the ability to dethrone him in a way.
There can be no question that the traditional conception, the Christian conception of the family, they considered their enemy, and they sought to replace it with the collectivization of, this is another reason why there's this bizarre phenomenon. And Engels even talks about it, I think, and I can't remember if it was in, I think it was in a pamphlet, I can't remember. But Engels talks about this funny thing where it's, why does the concept of sex always work its way in to leftist thinking about things? And why does it always include this idea of rampant promiscuity? Why does it always include this idea of completely removing any boundaries, any bourgeois morality from the...
It's just interesting. He always talks in these totalities, any boundaries, any morality or whatever. Yeah, I mean, with these right-wing people and their efforts to control sexuality and keep it in this traditional framework, like, well, what do we see happening? We see a lot of cheating, we see, a lot of terrible stories. We see, the more, this is the problem with repressing sexuality is it then tends to take more destructive forms, right? Like that's and I'm not saying that, modern liberal progressive culture figured it out yet. And there are problems with excess hedonism and promiscuity, which I think our society's in a constant kind of like sort of like a pendulum where it goes too far off in one direction. There was like Studio 54, and then there was like, now we have like trad wives and so on. But we're now also there's conscious open relationships, polyamory, which works for some people, doesn't work for some other people. And we also know when we look anthropologically at societies, throughout history, there's that fun book Sex at Dawn that my friend Chris Ryan wrote, which I really recommend. Some people have pushed back against that book and said that it was maybe too far in the other direction, but it does seem there were a lot of societies that organized sexuality differently, and this traditional morality thing wasn't even necessarily true for Christianity in earlier periods, even in like the Middle Ages. But anyway.
And bourgeois was really just Christian morality with respect to concepts of sex, because Christian concepts of sex were, sex is something that should be done between a man and a woman within the confines of marriage, both for intimacy between husband and wife and for the creation and raising of children. That's sex within the bourgeois morality, right? But in Marxist morality, sex is just a biological expression. It's just something to be enjoyed. And think about it. If there is no real heaven, right? And you're looking at what are some of the physical things that you can experience on earth that we have a drive toward and that we desire to experience. It's almost like they're offering as a substitute. We're asking you to give up the family. We're asking you to give up this morality. We're asking you to give up all these other things. But here's where we're offering you. You just get to go be promiscuous. Well, women would look at that as, well, wait a second. Okay, guys get to go be promiscuous, but we get pregnant.
Okay, let's stop here for a second. I wanted to bring up this fun article. Let's see if I can find it here. This was from the New York Times a while back by Kristen Goodsey, Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism. And it's from a book that she wrote about this topic. So let's just check this out for a minute. Why women had better sex under socialism. So she notes that a lot of women felt that they had a lot more freedom. This is a woman at a collective farm near Moscow, in a positive sense, under socialism in the 50s, 60s, and 70s than they did under the free market. A comparative sociological study of East and West Germans conducted after reunification in 1990 found that Eastern women had twice as many orgasms as Western women. Researchers marveled at this disparity and reported sexual satisfaction, especially since East German women suffered from the notorious double burden of formal employment and housework. In contrast, post-war West German women had stayed home and enjoyed all the labor-saving devices produced by the roaring capitalist economy, but they had less sex and less satisfying sex than women who had to line up for toilet paper. How to account for this facet of life behind the Iron Curtain. So then they talk about a woman, I think she's in Bulgaria. She was a single mother for many years. She insisted that her life before 1989 was more gratifying than the stressful existence of her daughter, who was born in the late 1970s. All she does is work and work, Mr. Charva told me in 2013. And when she comes home at night, she's too tired to be with her husband. But it doesn't matter because he is tired too. They sit together in front of the television like zombies. When I was her age, we had much more fun. She doesn't understand how much harder it is now. It was so easy for women before the wall fell, she told me. This was a German woman. They had kindergartens and creches, and they could take maternity leave and have their jobs held for them. I work contract to contract now, and I don't have time to get pregnant. Russia extended full suffrage to women in 1917. Let's see. It's a really great piece, actually. As early as 1952, Czechoslovak sexologists started doing research on the female orgasm. And in 1961, they held a conference solely devoted to the topic, said Katerina Leskova, a professor from Czech Republic. They focused on the importance of the equality between men and women as a core component of female pleasure. Some even argued that men need to share housework and child rearing, otherwise there would be no good sex. So if you read this piece, the result has been that many of the advances in women's liberation in the former Warsaw Pact countries have been lost or reversed. Mr. Chava's adult daughter and the younger Miss Gruber now struggle to resolve the work-life problems that communist governments had once solved for their mothers. The Republic gave you my freedom, Mr. Chava once told me, referring to the People's Republic of Bulgaria. Democracy took some of that freedom away. As for Miss Gruber, she has no illusions about the brutalities of East German communism. She just wishes, quote, things weren't so much harder now. Because they champion sexual equality at work, at home, and in the bedroom, and willing to enforce it, communist women who occupied positions in the state apparatus could be called cultural imperialists. But the liberation they imposed radically transformed millions of lives across the globe, including those of many women who still walk among us as the mothers and grandmothers of adults in the now democratic member states of the United Nations. So basically, the women, according to this perspective, believed that they had more good sex, more romance, more domestic happiness. Sure, some things were bad during that time, but my life was full of romance, said the Bulgarian woman. After my divorce, I had my job and my salary, and I didn't need a man to support me. I could do as I pleased. So, I think that's, something to keep in mind here as we go back to these white men who know what it's like for everybody and believe that their patriarchal traditional family is got to be the way for everybody in the future, and then we got to create a theocratic fascist state so that they get to have this situation that they believe benefits them. Where is this thing?
Andrea was right when she came on the podcast several months ago and said that you can't really separate feminism from Marxism.
Yeah.
She actually argued that Marxism was feminist.
Yeah.
The traditional understanding is that feminism is kind of the natural consequence of Marxism. But she does have a good point when you argue that, well, of course, if you're starting from these kind of first order concepts or principles, you will inevitably get to feminism in the same way that if you start with feminism, even though a lot of feminists won't admit it, you will eventually get to trend.
Yeah, so fascinatingly, if you try to liberate people from unnecessary economic want by reducing the disparity between rich and poor and creating social services and free nurseries and free kindergartens and so on, women will actually get to experience more freedom. And these guys don't really want that. They want something else, whatever they want. What they think they want. I actually think that...
maybe for why?
I think they may actually be leftists who don't know they're leftists, to be honest, as I watch this.
Point of their worldview, which is diametrically opposed to ours. So there is no policy that they can recommend where we can come to agreement on it, because we're not even talking about the same
You're not even
thing.
at the same starting point.
Yeah, we're not even at the same starting point.
And on that front, on the next one with academia, do we want to go into?
Yeah, let's go into, okay, so that first.
Yeah, they're not at the same starting point. They don't actually want women to have freedom. They don't, they want to get people back in, the trad wife back in the kitchen, have kids at an early age, not really be able to develop her career, and take the vote away from them. Peter Thiel has said that taking away the vote from women is one of his goals.
The Marxist interpretation of the individual is you were primordial goo, and we've evolved to this particular point, and your obligation first and foremost is to yourself. It's to your own self-actualization, and you must be liberated from all of these other conceptions, and the family is just one more oppressive power structure that is holding you back, and now we're going to liberate you from the family. Whereas again, the Christian.
Yeah, I just don't understand, once again, primordial goo, just all these weird ideas. Marxism was based on scientific materialism, and I don't agree with that. I'm an analytic or monistic idealist, as I've often said. I believe that consciousness is the underlying reality, and that we're expressions or projections of this underlying field of consciousness. And I believe that quantum physics supports that, as well as other recent discoveries. And this monistic or analytic idealist philosophy is becoming slowly more prevalent. Bernardo Kastrup has written a number of great books about it. He was a former scientist at CERN, so he explores it in a very rigorous way. It's also what Eastern metaphysics talk about, like Tibetan Buddhism talks about reality as the nature of a dream that's arising from this ground of primordial awareness and so on. But within that, we have a lot of choice, and that underlying field of consciousness is exploring its own creative potential, its potential for feeling and love and so on. Whereas these guys have read an old book and they've been indoctrinated since childhood in a Christian morality, and they, for whatever fanatic reason, believe that it's their right to impose that on everybody else, and they're angry about it, they're frustrated for whatever reason.
Christian or the traditionalist or the conservative says, no, the family is the building block of the rest of civilization. So this is where we say this is key terrain that we're fighting over, and there is no reconciliation between these two.
Obviously families are the building block of civilization, but families can be organized in different ways. And once again, as I said last time, fundamentalism, this type of regressive fundamentalism, is actually a postmodern phenomenon. Interestingly enough, it's like they're trying to reconstitute something that never actually existed, this imagined purity. It's always like that with fundamentalisms.
Two positions. The second one we're going to talk about as key terrain is academia, and we're going to go right to Gramsci on this one. Do you got the quote?
Yep, here it is. He says, the mode of being, I've read it off before when we did our podcast on Gramsci, but it's worth repeating. He says, the mode of being of the new intellectual can no longer consist in eloquence, which is an exterior and momentary mover of feelings and passions, but in active participation in practical life as constructor, organizer, permanent persuader, and not just a simple orator. What he's getting at is that education is always a form of persuasion and indoctrination.
Yeah.
And that intellectuals who engage in quote unquote education are persuading. They're not merely educating. They're kind of one and the same. And so the act of the intellectual is not to just give great speech. He says here, it doesn't just consist in eloquence, right? Eloquence might move a crowd momentarily, but that doesn't necessarily persuade. Well, the purpose is to change minds and change opinions.
Which also means the application of pressure.
This is also why people that come out of this school, I've got a quote here from this guy, Henry Giraud, who's also a Marxist, coming straight out of this same school. He says, those arguing that education should be neutral are really arguing for a version of education in which nobody is accountable. There's a trend here. I showed it with Mark.
Yeah, I would say more that this whole idea of neutrality doesn't exist, right? Like you have to inculcate some set of values and cultural ideals and cultural norms and also kind of tradition, however you educate people, whether it's homeschooling, whether it's in a big public school and so on. anyway, he's obsessed with
Influential
this.
people in academia. He wrote Critical Pedagogy, or Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of the world. And again,
So that's Pablo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And once again, I'm a little bit impressed with their study of these texts, and I feel their hostile fascination with them might just be like 1 degree away from them acknowledging that these are actually true. But of course, from this Seven Mountains perspective, they're actually taking what guys like Gramsci and Freire said, I'm now realizing as I watch this, and applying it to how they reconstruct the social order for their permanent benefit, which is what we see the whole Trumpian attempt is right now. So yeah, I completely agree with what Pablo Freire said. I think he's correct. Education can be used to indoctrinate, to control, to force people into obsolete in a way and regressive modes of being, or it can be used to emancipate and liberate people so that they have freedom. Now, the only thing that I would add to that, as a mystic and as an analytic idealist, I do think that scientific materialism has held back human progress. It became an article of faith of modern civilization. It's still an article of faith in the left. And once we recognize that that is actually an absolute ideology, and we understand that consciousness is the central facet of being human, then the exploration, the development of consciousness, initiation practices, and so on will become central to a new cultural world after whatever this thing is crashes and burns.
For Paulo Freire, that was all about critical theory. So again, once again, rooted in various versions of Marx. Bell Hooks, that was her pen name. The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. It should be a place where we confront and dismantle the values of domination, capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy that underpin traditional family structures and social norms. This was in her book, Teaching to Transgress. Education is...
I mean, I love that he's reading, this black, feminist genius. And, clearly all this stuff sticks in their craw, and they have to just keep, kind of cogitating on it, because to admit that it was right would be completely destructive to this, false ideology they've built around themselves.
Is the practice of freedom. So understand, they're using these words freedom, but in their world, it's liberation from what you said, reality. It's not just liberation from government oppression. It's liberation from all of these various norms or traditions or customs or religions which inhibit you from being what cultural Marxism says you should be.
In many cases, state intervention.
I mean, it's actually liberation into reality, because, we have the capacity to invent ourselves and create ourselves. And in fact, I think a lot of, unfortunately, in a capitalist system based on domination and exploitation, people are trained from a very early age to use a lot of their innate and inherent genius to suppress their own capacities to self-develop and to inquire and to evolve in unique and special and beautiful ways. It's very unfortunate, in fact.
Intervention's actually necessary to achieve the freedom.
Yes.
Right? You can't have the fully sovereign individual, self-actualized, floating bundle of right.
It's interesting because he's fully sovereign individual. I mean, this is where they're toggling. I mean, I don't even know if they know, but the sovereign individual is a phrase from Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel's favorite book, which was called The Sovereign Individual, which basically argues that the nation state is collapsing, sort of in a way traditional capitalism is ending. The future of a digital society will be one where you'll have these kind of like, techno-feudal overlords who can build cities based on their own principles. It's basically like a new feudalism where you have a few sovereign individuals who are liberated to do whatever they want, and everybody else is kind of like under their boot. It has nothing to do with the leftist, quote unquote, the liberal vision, the far leftist vision. It's a right libertarian vision that's actually become part of their movement. So they're confusing things.
It's without the state providing
Yeah.
the necessary means and material conditions in order for you to achieve your freedom, in order for you to achieve your self-actualization.
Yeah.
And so they're using a lot of the same language that like classical liberals or libertarians might use, sometimes even conservatives might use. But the application in many of these terms, like liberation and justice and freedom, these are all terms that the left uses. You hear them all the time, but they mean it in a very different way.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just don't agree that the left is trying to. I mean, they see it animated by this like sort of hatred, whereas I see somebody like Marx actually animated by love and compassion, and wanting to see people have the capacity to self-actualize. I also recommend my favorite political essay, Oscar Wilde's essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he talks about how in the current system of domination and so on, most people don't get to really cultivate their unique self. They're not given the chance or the opportunity to develop their gifts. That's why you find that, if you look back at the history of like artists and writers, a lot of them were wealthy. They had trust funds. They were from wealthy families. That gave them this opportunity to cultivate their unique gifts, which then leads to new possibilities for humanity as a whole, new symbols, new images, new structures, and so on. And I would say that we want a lot more of that. I mean, anyway, if you get a chance, read that Oscar Wilde essay. It's mind-blowing.
Absolutely. When you're talking to a libertarian or a classical liberal, usually they refer to freedom in the sense of freedom from oppression from government forces or coercive forces outside of, what you've chosen. So,
and they mean it as freedom to achieve what I want,
but when
using the state to allow me to do it.
Well, that and the left also tends to seem to use these terms as a rebellion, not just against government control, but against actual structures of what is, whether it be scientific, whether it's God, the family, or anything else.
The hell is she talking about? I mean, the Trumpian Christian theocratic right is the one that's denying evidence and science. They're destroying all climate research, even statistics from sociologists who are studying, or economists who are studying what's happening to the economy. They're getting rid of research departments. They're getting rid of, kind of research into how to cure children's cancers and so on. I mean, the, kind of progressive liberals under Biden were very pro-science, as were the different communist groups.
All of the structures that exist so that we can then free flow find our way differently. I mean, one thing I saw a while back, they did a quote study where this guy was locked in, with no light or anything at the base of some kind of a cavern or something with no light at all. Mm. And what they observed is that his sleep patterns changed to where he would be awake for a 20.
Oh yeah, this is a kind of, I don't even understand what she's talking about, to be honest, but we'll let her just do her thing. Okay, so yeah, I mean, they just have a very bizarre idea of what liberals and leftists want. I mean, I think from my own perspective, traditional families are fine if somebody is happy with that. I think it's also fine if people want to experiment with other conditions. I mean, each person should have a range of choices and ultimately be able to find what corresponds to their own nature. So anyway.
And he created new patterns because his body was so confused.
Yeah.
Don't sit here and act like this is healthy for us. And so it's this idea that if we just, tear apart the fabric of reality enough, we may find some other way of being that.
Well, I think the point, though, that what I made before is that it's really this capitalism has, by focusing on the financial profit motive above all things, is the actual system that has stripped away all values. And in a way, the Christian right world is correct that that's gone too far, but and in a way, the communism also, because it was trapped in that scientific materialist worldview, went too far. But yeah, there's another way forward. I guess there's could be a what I would call like a Hegelian dialectical synthesis of these different perspectives that would allow people to live in freedom and peace. Yeah, we have to break through this sort of fanatic desire on the part of these people to control society. And I know they keep saying we're doing that, but I think a lot of that is projection.
It transcends this.
Well, and the other thing too that's very important to understand about academia and really education in general is that, okay, once again, look at it from the perspective of the left. If we're trying to dismantle the family because they look at it as an oppressive hierarchy structure, but we still have.
Once again, it's not dismantling the family; it's offering more options. Nobody's being stopped from being married and having a kid. Whereas they want to like stop people from, maybe being even gay or, having a non-traditional family structure. They prefer traditional families, and then people cheat and get drunk, and you have Pete Hegseths and all these other characters, Trump and so on. So it's like tradition plus malfeasance for those who can get away with it.
The problem remains, how do we educate? Well, then you educate through the state. You educate through the collective. Well, then as soon as I can get the child out of your hands, because if I'm operating.
But I think also the point is, in a large scale society like we have now, you need people to have some shared context, right? Like, in a way, I in some ways I feel a sadness about the television was kind of stupid in the 70s and 80s, but at least in big rock and roll and so on, at least kids grew up in a shared culture where we could all talk about the same things, and now that's kind of gone away. And in a way, it adds to the confusion. Anyway,
operating if the key terrain is education, and if I'm operating in an environment that has not adopted Marxism, then how do I get you to give me your child? How do I get you to give me your child so that I can educate them in a way that is the opposite or different from the way that you would educate them? Well, I have to set up systems that entice you to do so. If I can't take your child and we don't operate in an environment where I can, then I have to create conditions whereby it makes sense to you to hand over your child. Now, there's going to be.
Yeah, because maybe you want your kid to like learn basic stuff. And the whole idea was to separate church and state, right? So, to learn science-based principles and mathematics and so on. Like it's not that big a deal, buddy.
A lot of people look at that and be like, Nick, that's ridiculous. My teacher, when I was growing up in elementary school in the 1980s, wasn't a Marxist trying to they were just teaching me math and reading. Sure. Why? Because there is a use case, there is a logical argument within a market economy to say, I'm going to outsource certain responsibilities for teaching to a different entity, to someone that is specialized within this field. Right? There's a perfectly logical and reasonable explanation for that. However, if you are a Marxist, if you are someone that believes in dismantling the family, if you are someone that believes that education is a tool in order to equip future generations to believe other things, where would you go to do that?
But isn't that exactly what he believes? He said that he believes that Christianity is objective, and it's the objective truth. He makes that statement over and over again. So he basically wants to inculcate kids or have them inculcated in this ideology, which a lot of these guys, Matt Walsh, who I'm sure this guy's friends with, on Twitter defines themselves as a theocratic fascist, who says that basically, he wants a society that completely conforms to his ideology, and other people who don't conform to that ideology, wouldn't be able potentially to live in the country. So, they're basically using these really stupid, I would say, sophistries, arguments that don't hold water as a arrogant mechanism for trying to attack pluralism and also having a baseline of coherence in scientific reasoning and literacy and so on that make a decent society and a functional society.
Well, the first wave of people that did it in higher education. Because if you want to teach in a public school in the United States, in fact, if you want to teach in most schools in the United States, what is required of you? Oh, a degree. You have to have a degree. Well, if you have to get this degree and you want to teach, well, where are you going to go to get? Well, you're going to get a teaching degree. Well, okay, so what is the most liberal Marxist element of just about any college university? Is it the economics department or is it the education department?
Once again, as I listen to him, I mean, I guess because it's, in some ways he's constantly trying to attack things that I think are more true than what he's talking about. But I just feel this underlying frustration and anger in him. Yeah, I don't know. It's so my sort of like weird innate intuition is that these guys are actually one hair's breadth away from flipping the script on themselves and realizing that this is all garbage and becoming more leftist and understanding that they're fascinated with Pablo Freire and Gramsci and Marx, because these guys had great insights. Like, we do have a capitalist ideology. We do have a culture based on exploitation and domination. We do have class war. We do have an oligarchy that uses the kind of imposition of the sort of regressive Christian ideology to sort of keep enough people in a kind of mind control state that they can then do these terrible other things, like destroying the planet's ecology, with this endless quest for oil and gas. And, yeah, I mean, I'm sure he's I'm sure he believes climate change is a myth also, but I haven't, checked him out on that yet, but I'm sure it'll come up.
Is it the studies departments? You think that's by accident? No, it's because if this is your mission, if your mission is to seize this key terrain, then I'm going to go into academia, and then I'm looking at it going, well, gosh.
So once again, he's implying that there is this organized kind of like leftist, I guess this is feeding into the current Trump administration's whole thing with Antifa and the left. Apparently these FBI agents have been, going to people who went to peaceful protests, and asking them where they got their funding from. So that he has this idea that there's a mission, there's some organized leftist group. And, yeah, I mean, ironically, back in the 50s, there probably was, from Russia, efforts to disseminate a communist ideology in the U.S. There was the McCarthy era and so on. I'm sure the U.S. was doing the same thing, in communist countries. And today, recently, Putin did a huge amount of incredibly cutting work. You have to give a hand to Russia, which is, should have been a much weaker country than the U.S., but they used what they call political technology and information warfare to soften Americans up for authoritarianism and for Putinism. And obviously this is why Trump really doesn't want to go against Putin, because Putin is really his coach and his teacher in how to dismantle America and rebuild it as a fascist state. So yeah, so there's a mission there, and the Heritage Foundation, which actually, if you read Jane Mayer's book Dark Money, back in the 1960s, a number of right-wing Christian, quote unquote, libertarian billionaires came together, and they were like, we don't like the direction of America. We want to impose our old thing. We want to go back to, 1830s or whatever. And we see it's going to take many decades to do that. So we need to build academic departments. We need to, support people like Milton Friedman or Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve. We need movements that look like these organic grassroots movements of the left, so like the ecology movement or feminism. So they created things like the Tea Party, and they also had huge war chests to study psyops and different ways of manipulating society and so on. And what we're seeing with the current fiasco that is Trumpism, the success of all of that, and these guys are just either conscious participants, and or willing stooges, maybe both, in this very destructive effort that if it's allowed to continue, yeah, we will see some really terrible decades here, and maybe even worse if the belligerence of these guys escalates to nuclear war or concentration camps and all that stuff.
How do I staff every single public school with X, Y? That's impossible. Well, what if I can control the credentialing? Now, if I can be the one that is controlling the teaching degrees from the universities for which most people go to get their teaching degrees, well, now I can infuse critical pedagogy, and I can make it mandatory as a part of getting your degree.
And keep them there as long.
I mean, I do think there's an element of truth in the fact that, the left was kept out of American politics after the 60s and 70s. There was an organic left, and I mentioned this in one of the other talks, that was trying to emerge back then. But the military-industrial intelligence complex went after it with everything they got, which included, assassinations of people like Freddie Hampton, the Black Panther leader, who was killed by the FBI, I believe. But you also had Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, JFK, RFK. Then you had trumped-up drug charges against a lot of leaders of the left. So they basically, then you had the wholesale shooting of nonviolent protesters at Kent State. So basically, the American empire with its military intelligence apparatus would not allow there to be an organic left political movement in the U.S. in the 70s. So a lot of those people who might have been part of that movement then had to do something with their lives. So yeah, they probably did go into academia, and then there was this kind of twist towards this identity politics, which I really didn't like myself, which was sort of the part of the left that worked with corporations and greenwashing and the sort of DEI and cancel culture and so on. So yeah, I mean, there is an evolution there, but it was basically, I'd say the origin of it from my perspective was that the American empire wouldn't allow there to be an organic movement against this sort of capitalist imperialism.
Is possible by adding extra classes that aren't even a part of what you want to teach, adding those classes so they could keep you there as long as possible.
So the way to think about this, again, from a strategic standpoint, the way to think about this is not everybody that wants to be as a teacher is a Marxist. That's obviously untrue. The way to think of it is not every single school was designed by Marxists to do Marxist indoctrination. That's not true. The way to think about it is certain institutions and professions exist. Those institutions and professions exist to perform certain functions. If I have an objective and I want to educate children, then if I go into those institutions and professions, I can maximize the impact of carrying out what I believe is an incredibly moral and noble purpose of teaching future generations to throw off the shackles of these bourgeois family structures, of this bourgeois morality, of this culture which elevates the oppressor above the oppressed. Now, ask yourself honestly. Don't ask yourself, does every school teach this? Don't ask yourself if every teacher teaches this. Ask yourself this one very important question. From the time you were in elementary school to now, have you seen a significant trend in one direction? If the answer to that is yes, and I am telling you it is yes because I served on the education committee for 4 years in the Virginia House of Delegates and constantly had these issues brought before us. If the answer to that is yes, well, then you have to come to the conclusion that what Gramsci was talking about, what Freire was talking about, what all these other people were talking about, they took seriously and looked at academia and education as the way to educate children to believe something that their parents did not.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I sympathize with this sense that, scientific materialism combined with, other ideologies, capitalist or leftist, kind of leads to this disintegration of values and kind of a sense that we don't know then, what to do as humans. And that kind of like void or abyss is kind of where we've been at, back since like Nietzsche and Rimbaud and so on. The death of God, I am another, and so on. But I don't think personally that the way to answer that abyss is by reinstituting obsolete forms of Christian morality. I think there's something new that needs to constellate and come together, and that is kind of this monistic or analytic idealism, understanding that we're all aspects of this underlying field of consciousness, that in fact the world is a bit like a living dream that we're all co-creating. And in that sense, we have a lot of power, and there may actually be ways that our spirits and souls continue through something like reincarnation. Amit Goswami wrote about this in Physics of the Soul and so on, or Self-Aware Universe. and therefore, you end up with a little bit of a, from my perspective, there was a potential unification of, a evolved scientific perspective, quantum physics, everything we're learning about, the body-mind system and so on, morphogenetic fields, morphic resonance, how cultures are constructed, how ideologies are formed and hold together cultures and so on. But yes, a liberation from these obsolete ideas and structures in a productive sense, where we would say that if we're all aspects of this unified field of consciousness, we should have universal care for each other. We should seek to make a society that's better for all. I mean, it's pathetic with all of the wealth of America, how, most people are just poorly educated. We could have we could have truly had a great society, and instead we have a pretty miserable society. And unfortunately, these guys with their, rock solid ideology, regressive zealotry and fanaticism are, who've taken control of our situation, are going to make it much worse, unless they can course correct, which I'm trying to help them to do, but who's going to listen to this video and endless hours of this yabbering?
And that leads us into the next area that we're going to talk, the next piece of key terrain, arts and entertainment. Now I asked...
Okay, well, I'm going to stop here for today. This might be the end of my investigation of poor Nick Freitas and his little troupe with their millions of followers and hundreds of thousands of views, and his massive arm muscles and all that stuff. I hope this was helpful. It was useful for me, actually. I really understood more of how entrenched these guys are in understanding, kind of leftist worldviews and concepts. On the one hand, so they can take them and assimilate them and use those teachings to win their ideological war. But also, I have this weird underlying feeling watching all of this, that these guys are not actually that far from cracking. I mean, I'm thinking about like the late 50s, early 60s. There were sociologists who were writing about, the sort of gray flannel man and so on. They were like, that they thought that generation of the early 60s was going to be the most conformist generation in history. And then they ended up getting inspired by, rock and roll and, beat poetry and, kind of surrealism and mysticism. And we had the 60s and their sort of radicalization of society and so on. And these guys are like, there's in their kind of like panic and their pressure, it feels like they're holding back the dam on their own potential liberation. And I hope they have a breakthrough. More some other time.